On the 13th of January, 1888, weather stations from Bismarck to Sioux City logged morning temperatures near -20 degrees Fahrenheit and afternoon highs still below zero. Rail traffic stalled. Schoolhouses emptied too late. In thousands of one-room cabins across the northern plains, the routine was the same. Fire the iron stove hard, bake a week's worth of bread, then hide the loaves from cold and mice in whatever safe place seemed obvious: root cellar, nailed box, or pantry corner. The inputs were expensive. Flour had come 200 to 300 miles by rail and wagon. Yeast cakes and kerosene were cash purchases. Wood meant hours on a bucksaw. Yet in many houses, half the week's baking went sharp, clammy, or blue-flecked by midweek. Bread was treated like potatoes, put it in the coldest space. In a smaller number of cabins, the numbers looked different. The loaves weren't moved down. They were lifted 3 feet up into the warm, dry band above the stove. The logs, the weather, and the ledgers would decide which method lasted. Frost halos ringed iron nail heads along the lower logs. The stovepipe ticked as it heated. A wooden dough trough sat on a table near the only window, dusted with flour from the morning's work. Manuals and newspaper household columns treated bread as a solved problem. Proper kneading, proper oven temperature, perhaps a word about yeast quality. The baking itself was mechanical. On the northern plains, the real problem surfaced after the loaves left the oven. Keeping bread sound for 5 to 7 days in a one-room box with extreme gradients of cold, heat, and moisture. Settler families from the Midwest brought the same bread routines they had practiced in Iowa or Ohio. Once or twice weekly baking was standard. It saved fuel. It saved labor. It let a household organize around predictable cooking days, usually Saturdays. Recent Scandinavian immigrants were accustomed to large batches of rye bread stored near ceilings or in lofts, but many now lived in simpler single-room log and sod houses without the multi-story structure they had known in the old country. The typical cabin measured 14 by 18 feet, or 16 by 20 feet at most. A single cook stove sat against a long wall. Interior height reached 7 to 8 feet at the ridge. There was no separate pantry, no dedicated larder, no cool room. Everything happened in that volume: cooking, sleeping, eating, drying clothes, storing tools, and keeping a week's worth of staples accessible but safe. Weekly baking meant 4 to 8 loaves of wheat or mixed bread, each 1½ to 2 pounds. Compressed yeast cakes or potato starters provided the rise. Flour arrived in 98 to 196-pound sacks, hauled 20 to 50 miles by wagon from rail points, where millers freighted it in from Fargo, Sioux City, or Minneapolis. Every sack represented cash outlay and freight costs. Wasting flour meant more than inconvenience. It meant another trip to the store, another expenditure when credit was already stretched thin. Land office and census records show dense settlement along particular creeks by Norwegian, German, and American-born farmers between 1880 and 1885. Agricultural bulletins and cookbooks from the period recommended weekly baking explicitly to conserve fuel and time. The Dakota Farmer and other territorial newspapers ran household columns that took the practice for granted. Consolidating baking into one day saved fuel and labor, but it concentrated risk. If storage failed, an entire week's bread had to be discarded, choked down sour, or fed to livestock. That meant starting over: more yeast, more flour, more firing of the stove, more hours at the table, kneading and shaping. The system worked only if the bread kept. The same one-room plan that simplified heating also magnified every mistake in where bread was set down between Sunday and Saturday. Damp timber steps descended into darkness. Earthen walls wept slightly in the thaw cycles. Wooden bins of potatoes and turnips lined one side. The smell was earth and cabbage. Temperature held at 35 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, just above freezing. Generations of farmers had learned that cool and moist cellars kept roots and apples from shriveling through the winter. Potatoes stored in dry air would lose water and wrinkle. Cabbages needed high humidity or their outer leaves would turn papery. The principle was well established in agricultural practice. Keep produce cold and nearly saturated, and it would last months. The same rule was applied reflexively to bread. If cold preserves, colder must be better. If the cellar works for potatoes, it should work for bread. The logic seemed sound. Bread was perishable. Cellars preserved perishables. Therefore, bread belonged in the cellar. Settler habit reinforced the pattern. Anything valuable went below frost, out of sunlight, away from mice and insects. The cellar was the safest space in the house. Expensive goods went down. A typical root cellar measured 6 to 8 feet deep with cribbed timber or fieldstone walls. A plank or sod roof carried 2 to 3 feet of earth cover for insulation. Some cellars had a single vent pipe, many had none. Air circulation was minimal. Humidity approached 100% in the shoulder seasons when melting snow and ground moisture seeped through walls. The bread storage routine followed a simple pattern. Loaves baked in the morning were cooled on the table for a short time, then stacked in a wooden box or placed on a shelf in the cellar, often while still warm inside. The goal was to get them out of the way, protected, stored in the coldest available space. Physical reality intervened. Warm bread, internal crumb temperature still 90 to 100 degrees Fahrenheit, met air just above freezing and nearly saturated. Condensation formed immediately on crust and cloth. Moisture that had evaporated from the loaf during baking now returned, soaking into the outer surface and any wrapping. The loaf couldn't dry. It sat in a humid envelope, the perfect environment for mold spores that were already present in flour, on hands, in cloth, and in the air. Agricultural bulletins from the 1880s described recommended cellar temperatures and humidity levels for root vegetables with precision. Household guides advised cellars for perishables without distinguishing between roots and baked goods. The category error went unexamined. Within 48 to 72 hours, first mold spots appeared on cut faces where moisture and spores were concentrated. The sliced end of a loaf exposed to maximum surface area and handling failed first. By midweek, bread stored in the cellar showed blue or green patches. The smell turned sour. Families ate around the spots, scraped off the visible growth, or fed the ruined loaves to chickens and pigs. The very space that could hold cabbages for half a winter could spoil bread before Wednesday. In a larger log house, poles lashed just below the ceiling carried hay twist bundles for fuel, lanterns when not in use, and occasionally strings of dried bread or rusks. Smoke staining outlined where warm air flowed from the stove toward the chimney. The poles were expedient storage, a way to use dead space overhead. Barns, granaries, and some kitchens already employed height to avoid dampness. Hay went to lofts, stacked above livestock to keep it dry and free of manure gases. Grain bins were elevated off the ground. Dried goods, herbs, peppers, onion braids, hung overhead in farmhouse kitchens. The principle was embedded in agricultural practice. Certain things stay sound when kept high. Scandinavian and German farm tradition used two-story houses extensively. Full lofts above heated living spaces served as drying areas for grain, flax, and bread. In Nordic kitchens, flat rye loaves with central holes were baked in large batches and stored by threading them on poles suspended from the ceiling, where warm air from the stove kept them dry for months. The method was so common it barely required explanation. Bread belonged in the warmest, driest layer of the house. American-born settlers in simpler cabins relied more on boxes, pantries, and cellars. Height was less automatically employed. The architectural vocabulary was different. A single-story cabin with minimal headroom did not invite overhead storage in the same way a Nordic loft house did. Yet even in single-room cabins, some families, constrained by space and accustomed to vertical thinking, added light ceiling poles or a plank rack over the stove to air clothes and keep small items dry. Mittens, gloves, and socks were hung there after washing. Lanterns lived there when not in use. Occasionally, bread ended up on the rack just to cool after baking. Loaves left there while the baker attended to other tasks were noticed hours later to be dry-crusted but still intact. They lasted longer than loaves moved immediately to the cellar or a closed box. The observation was not recorded in letters or diaries with any frequency. It appeared as unmarked practice, a habit formed from results rather than from theory. Where loft traditions met one-room cabins, height was already understood as a method to escape dampness, even if nobody had yet built a slatted rack specifically and exclusively for bread. Ethnographic accounts and architectural surveys from the late 19th and early 20th centuries note ceiling-hung bread in Finnish and Swedish kitchens as standard practice. North American barn and loft practices that kept hay and grain high were equally well documented. The conceptual tools existed. They simply had not yet been applied with intention to the problem of keeping wheat bread fresh through a plains winter week. The solution to sour bread was already nailed into rafters and beams. It simply hadn't been assigned to loaves yet. A strip of wool tied to a rafter over the stove leaned steadily toward the chimney whenever the fire was up. The angle changed with the intensity of the draft. Frost feathered the lower logs in lacy patterns, but above shoulder height, the wood stayed clear and dry. Most settlers understood heat rises in a general way, but few treated air currents as something to design around. Warmth was chased with more wood, not with strategic placement of objects. The assumption was simple: a hot stove makes a warm room. Any cold spots are failures of the stove or the fuel supply. Stovemaker catalogs emphasized firebox size, fuel type, and surface area for cooking. They said nothing about room air patterns. The equipment was sold as a heat source, not as a driver of circulation. Later building physics measurements in preserved cabins show temperature stratification of 10 to 20 degrees Fahrenheit from floor to ceiling under steady firing. The air moves in a loop, it rises from the stovetop and pipe, spreads across the ceiling, cools as it contacts the outer walls, sinks along those walls, and returns as a cooler layer at ankle level. The pattern is predictable and continuous. In severe cold, a typical cabin interior measured 35 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit near the floor, 55 to 60 degrees at head height, and 65 to 70 degrees within a foot of the ceiling. The difference was not trivial. An object placed high in that ceiling stream saw more frequent air changes, lower relative humidity, and higher average temperature than an object in a dead corners, under furniture, or in a cellar. Air path mattered. Zones near the stove and along the ceiling were dynamic. Air moved. Moisture was carried away by the draft feeding the fire and by convection currents sweeping toward the chimney. Zones far from the stove, corners, spaces under beds, cellars, were stagnant. Air sat still. Moisture accumulated. 19th and early 20th century observations on stratification in stove-heated schoolhouses and cabins appeared in building manuals and engineering texts. Later, preservation studies using modern instrumentation measured gradients in log houses heated by wood stoves. The data confirmed what experience had already taught. A single-point heat source creates dramatic vertical variation in temperature and humidity within a small enclosed volume. Without changing the stove or adding fuel, simply moving an item from table height to the ceiling band changed its thermal and moisture environment significantly. A loaf stored 3 feet higher lived in a different climate. The implication was unavoidable. In the same 16 by 20-foot room, 2 loaves baked together could experience 2 entirely different storage environments, separated only by 3 vertical feet and the choice of where to set them down. A pine bread box with a tight-fitting lid rested on a side table. The hinges creaked slightly in the dry winter air. Inside, 4 loaves sat on bare boards, the box interior dark and still. Household advice from eastern states recommended closed boxes and cupboards to keep bread away from insects, dust, and mice. The principle was cleanliness and protection. Bread was a prepared food. It belonged in a clean, enclosed space, shielded from contamination. The tighter the box, the better the protection. The assumption made sense in warmer, more humid climates. In cities and towns with daily bakery deliveries, bread was consumed quickly. A box kept it fresh for a day or two. In rural areas with less frequent baking, the same enclosure became a problem. Settler priority was clear: keep animals and dirt off food in cramped quarters. Mice were a constant threat. Flies and ants appeared in warmer months. A closed box or tin was a mark of good housekeeping, a sign that the household was organized and sanitary. Later, food storage understanding revealed the flaw. Sealed boxes trap moisture and slow drying. If bread goes in too warm, still releasing steam from the crumb, the enclosed space fills with water vapor. Relative humidity inside the box climbs. The bread cannot dry. Moisture condenses on the lid and walls, then drips back onto the loaves or soaks into cloth wrappings. Bread boxes were often built of 3/4-inch pine or oak, sometimes lined with tin to prevent rodent damage. Interior volumes ranged from 1 to 2 cubic feet. Loaves were placed inside once they felt warm, not hot to the hand. Lids were closed immediately to keep freshness in. In a tight box at 50 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit with moisture from several loaves, relative humidity rapidly approached saturation. The environment inside the box was indistinguishable from that of a root cellar, except that it sat at room temperature instead of near freezing. Mold spores, which required moisture above a certain threshold, found ideal conditions. Kitchen guides from the EO 1880s described bread boxes and cupboards in detail. Farm memoirs referenced bread crock, bread tin, or cupboard as standard equipment. The advice was consistent: store bread in a clean, closed container. Protection from dust and pests came at the cost of airflow. In cold weather cabins, boxes replicated cellar humidity on a smaller scale, faster and at a less obvious location. The more carefully some families sealed their bread away, the faster the unseen growth started. 2 hand-hewn cleats spiked to the stove-side wall carried a light frame of slats just below the rafters. Drying mittens hung from one corner. Smoke staining marked the path of warm air rising from the pipe. The frame was likely installed for general drying and storage: lanterns, clothes, small tools. Its potential as bread gear emerged when loaves were set there to cool and simply kept better. The observation was accidental. The result was repeatable. Immigrant carpentry practice favored minimal ironwork and light section sizes. Nails were expensive. Heavy framing consumed lumber that could be used elsewhere. Overhead racks were built from whatever was available: split saplings, hand-riven slats, or boards left over from door and window framing. Present-day building historians, working from surviving interiors and tool marks, can infer dimensions and loads these frames carried. Museums preserving late 19th century farmhouses show recurring patterns. A plausible reconstruction: shelf width 10 to 14 inches, length 8 to 10 feet, slats 3/4 to 1 inch thick, spaced 1 to 1 and 1/4 inches apart. The slats were fastened to 2 longitudinal rails, which in turn rested on cleats or brackets attached to the wall logs. Mounting height: 6 to 12 inches below the ceiling, 12 to 24 inches horizontally from the nearest section of stovepipe to avoid direct scorching. Capacity: 8 to 12 2-pound loaves with 1-inch gaps between them. The spacing was critical. Loaves could not touch. Air had to circulate around every surface. A solid shelf would have defeated the purpose. Labor: 1 workday's sawing and nailing, 2 10-foot boards ripped into slats. a handful of nails, cleats cut from scrap. The cost was negligible. The skill required was basic carpentry, well within the ability of most homesteaders. Architectural surveys and museum interiors show ceiling racks and slatted shelves over stove lines in Norwegian, Swedish, and German-American farmhouses from the 1880s and 1890s. Nordic bread-hanging traditions using ceiling poles are documented in ethnographic studies and food history texts. Turning a solid shelf into slats allowed warm air to wash around every surface of each loaf. The updraft from the stove carried moisture away. Crusts dried, the bread firmened but stayed clean-smelling. Mold, which required sustained moisture, found no purchase. A day's work with a saw and auger could shift a week's bread into the cabin's driest stream of air without burning an extra stick of wood. Slate or penciled marks on the inside of a pantry door showed dates, hash marks, and short notes about baking days and keeping. Most families tracked flour and yeast simply as supplies. If anyone recorded where bread was kept and how long it lasted, those notes rarely survived in archives. The experiment can be reconstructed with modern test bakes under similar conditions. Historical food researchers replicating 19th century bread recipes under controlled environments have done exactly this. Building scientists measuring humidity and temperature at multiple heights in stove-heated test cabins provide the environmental data. The method: bake identical loaves and store them in 4 locations: root cellar, bread box, open table, and slatted ceiling rack. Operate the cabin interior to duplicate a plane's winter schedule. Strong morning and evening firings with the stove, idled midday and overnight to conserve wood. Log daily observations: visible mold, smell, crumb texture. Define last acceptable day as the final day before clear spoilage appears. Published experimental work on bread staling and mold under different humidity and airflow conditions provides baseline microbiology. Measured log house thermal data from heritage building studies provides the environmental parameters. The 2 data sets combined allow a reconstruction of what homesteaders would have observed. Result pattern from reconstructed trials. Root cellar, bread stayed soft longest, but surface mold appeared earliest, typically within 48 to 72 hours on cut faces. Whole loaves lasted slightly longer, but still showed growth by day 4 or 5. Bread box, moderate rate of staling, but early mold development, especially if loaves went in warm. Box storage extended life minimally over cellar storage. Typical safe window, 3 to 4 days. Open table, faster staling as crust dried in room air, but moderate mold development. The loaf hardened but remained edible longer than cellar or box storage. Safe window, 4 to 5 days. Loft rack, rapid dehydration of crust. Bread dried noticeably within 24 hours, becoming firm and sometimes hard by day 3. Mold development was delayed significantly. Bread tended to dry out rather than spoil visibly. Safe window, 6 to 8 days or more, depending on ambient humidity. The worst sensory result, dry, hard crust, was also the safest. Hardened bread could be softened in stews, soups, or coffee. Moldy bread was a loss. When the results were tallied, the least comfortable bread turned out to be the one that bought the most time. A store ledger rested on a high counter, thick with repeated entries for flour, yeast cakes, and occasional discarded returns. Outside, snowbanks still stood shoulder-high along the main street. The winter had been long. Homesteaders expected that once they solved housing and fuel, food waste would fall to negligible levels. In practice, spoiled bread continued to drain cash and labor. The problem was visible in the account books. Storekeeper records tracked flour sales spikes after storms and during extended cold snaps. When bread failed midweek, families had to rebake or buy. Either option cost money. Freight and rail records showed the supply chain clearly. Flour moved 150 to 300 miles from primary milling centers in Minneapolis, Fargo, and Sioux City. It traveled by rail to a siding, then by wagon to scattered homesteads. The freight cost per hundredweight added significantly to the base price of the flour. Each wasted 2-pound loaf represented not just flour, but freight charges, yeast, and fuel. At going wage rates for farm labor, roughly $1 to $1.50 per day in the mid-1880s, a failed baking day cost the equivalent of several hours of work. That did not account for the physical labor of cutting and hauling wood, which was unpaid but time-consuming. Climate compounded the problem. In months with persistent cold, each unnecessary baking day meant extra armloads of wood split and carried. Time spent at the sawbuck was time not spent mending fences, caring for livestock, or preparing for spring planting. In a homestead economy where every hour mattered, inefficiency was expensive. Freight rate tables, store ledgers, and agricultural reports from Dakota Territory and early statehood documented flour prices and availability. The data shows seasonal variation. Flour was cheapest in fall after harvest, most expensive in late winter when transport was difficult and supplies ran low. Cabins that lengthened bread life by even 2 days reduced baking frequency over a winter. Fewer baking days meant fewer yeast purchases, less fuel burned, and fewer trips to the store through difficult weather. The cumulative savings over a decade rivaled the cost of major tools or livestock. 3 vertical feet of storage difference could be measured later in hog weights, harness quality, or an extra wagon. Anything bought with the cash not burned as wasted bread and unnecessary baking. Weather forms tabulated lows below -20 degrees Fahrenheit. Notes in margins recorded drift heights and block section roads. Telegraph lines were reported down across multiple counties. The storm that became known as the Children's Blizzard struck on January 12, 1888, without warning. Temperatures dropped 50 degrees in hours. Winds exceeded 40 miles per hour. Visibility fell to 0. Many settlers had built and stored provisions as if each winter would resemble the last mild one. The winter of 1886 to 1887 had been manageable. The winter of 1887 to 1888 was not. Hard years tested every margin at once: fuel reserves, food stores, and structural integrity. Weather Bureau and Army Signal Service reports documented storm tracks and temperature spells. Local newspapers recorded fuel shortages, stranded trains, and relief shipments that arrived weeks late or not at all. The Fargo Forum, the Sioux City Journal, and the Dakota Republican all ran accounts of families trapped for days by drifts and cold. Multi-day whiteouts made travel impossible. Families relied entirely on what was already inside the cabin and cellar. Livestock froze in barns. Fuel supplies dwindled. Stove operation increased to nearly continuous firing to maintain survivable indoor temperatures. Indoor humidity swung wildly with each load of snow-tracked clothing melted for washing and every pot of water boiled for cooking or coffee. Bread was baked heavily before known storms to reduce the need for mid-blizzard firing. The goal was to fire the stove as few times as possible while the storm raged, conserving wood for heating rather than cooking. A week's worth of bread, baked in advance, allowed the stove to be run lean. Where bread spoiled early, within 2 to 3 days, families faced a choice: eat moldy bread, waste it, or fire the stove again to bake replacements. Each option carried cost. Firing for emergency baking consumed scarce fuel and added smoke and heat load to an already strained cabin environment. Where bread held on the rack through the storm, the question at week's end wasn't food availability. It was how hard the crust had dried and whether it needed soaking. During storm weeks, the difference between loft-kept bread and cellar bread wasn't a matter of comfort. It was a direct factor in whether the last sled load of wood lasted. Black and white interior photographs from the late 1880s and early 1890s show recurring elements: shelves above stoves, poles below rafters, hooks carrying sacks and rounds of food. The images are rare. Few homesteaders owned cameras, but when interiors were photographed, usually for insurance purposes or estate documentation, the patterns are visible. No patent was filed for a bread loft. Few letters singled it out by name. Diaries that mentioned bread storage at all used generic terms: shelves, racks, poles. The practice was visible but rarely labeled. Later observers had to reconstruct function from placement, soot marks, and wear patterns. Museum curators and architectural historians cataloging interior fittings in preserved houses noted the frequency of overhead shelves in Scandinavian and German-American farmhouses. Descendants interviewed in the mid-20th century described how grandmother kept bread up high so the mice and mold didn't reach it. The phrasing was casual, as if the method required no explanation. Overhead shelves became standard in new kitchens built after 1885. In some cases, they were enclosed as high cupboards with ventilated doors. In others, they remained open racks. Bread and rusks were dried on these racks before being moved to boxes or tins for long-term storage. The racks served as a transitional space, accelerating crust drying before final storage. Hanging bread and dried goods near ceilings remained normal in Scandinavian American communities well into the 20th century. The practice mirrored Finnish and Swedish tradition directly. In Finland, ceiling-hung bread on poles was documented continuously from medieval times through the 1900s. Swedish farmhouses used similar methods. German and Swiss alpine houses used overhead racks for drying meat, cheese, and bread. The design spread not as a new idea, but as part of general cabin optimization. It was another way to use dead space and copy what worked. Bread simply joined the list of items that belong high in a well-run plains kitchen, alongside lanterns, mittens, seed packets, and harness leather. House museum descriptions, oral histories, and ethnographic notes on ceiling-hung bread and food provide the documentary trail. The physical evidence, nail holes, smoke shadows, wear marks on rafters, appears in buildings across the upper Midwest and northern plains. By 1900, the practice was so common that it barely merited mention. Yet its fingerprints remained in the structures and in family stories about winter bread that didn't spoil. A table of figures, interior temperatures by height, relative humidity near floor versus loft, days to mold for bread in 4 storage locations. The data comes from modern research, but the environment is historic. Intuition treated cold as the universal preservative. Measurements show that for bread, warmth plus dryness often beats cold plus damp. The physics are straightforward. Mold spores are ubiquitous. They exist in flour, on hands, in cloth, and in air. What triggers growth is not the presence of spores, but the environment, temperature, moisture, and available nutrients. Bread provides nutrients. Temperature in a homestead cabin is variable, but generally within the range where mold can grow, above freezing, below 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The controlling factor is moisture. Modern food science data on mold growth shows clear thresholds. At relative humidity below 60%, mold growth is slow. Above 75%, growth accelerates. Above 85%, it is rapid. Temperature modulates the rate, but does not change the basic relationship. Log building and heritage house studies measuring stratification and air change rates in stove-heated cabins provide the environmental half of the equation. Combine the 2 data sets and the picture clarifies. A loaf in a root cellar experiences temperatures of 35 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit and relative humidity near 100%. Cool temperature slows mold slightly, but saturation creates ideal conditions. Net result, mold appears within 2 to 3 days. A loaf in a bread box at room temperature, 50 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit, sits in a small enclosed volume with humidity, elevated by moisture released from warm bread. Relative humidity inside a closed box with fresh bread can exceed 90%. Mold appears within 3 to 4 days. A loaf on an open table experiences room air at 50 to 60 degrees and moderate humidity, perhaps 60 to 70%, depending on cabin conditions. Staling occurs faster. Mold appears more slowly. Safe window, 4 to 5 days. A loaf on a slatted loft rack in the stove's updraft experiences 65 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit and relative humidity of 40 to 60%, depending on firing schedule and outside weather. Crust dehydrates rapidly. Internal moisture migrates outward and evaporates. The loaf firms and hardens but stays clean. Safe window, 6 to 8 days or longer. Families who unconsciously treated bread like timber, requiring a dry, ventilated environment, gave themselves an invisible buffer every time the weather turned. A larger frame farmhouse showed a clear vertical hierarchy. Root cellar below, kitchen on ground floor, pantry on an interior wall away from exterior cold, storage under the eaves. In the kitchen, high shelves flanked the chimney. The design was intentional. Early cabins had been improvised shelters built just enough to satisfy homestead requirements and get through a first winter. As farms stabilized and families accumulated capital, they built better. Second-generation houses incorporated lessons from years of watching where mold, frost, and rot appeared first. Carpenters and builders began designing pantries with ventilated cupboards and planned overhead storage. Agricultural writers urged dry, airy storage for certain foods and cool, moist for others. The distinction was now explicit. Root vegetables belonged in the cellar. Grains, flour, and bread belonged higher and drier. Houses were now framed with designated pantry walls positioned on interior partitions where temperature swings were minimal. Screened cupboards allowed air circulation. High shelves were incorporated during construction, not added as afterthoughts. Some farmhouses included dedicated bread shelves above working height in the kitchen, positioned near the chimney where warm air naturally concentrated. Cellars continued in use for root vegetables, stored apples, and preserved goods in jars. But the function was now separated vertically within the house. Cold wet below, warm dry above, moderated storage in between. Building plans, farm journals, and extension literature from the 1890s described improved farmhouse kitchens and storage in detail. The Dakota Farmer, Nebraska Farmer, and other regional agricultural papers ran illustrated articles on farmhouse design. The advice was consistent: match storage conditions to contents. The same reasoning that lifted bread into the warmest air influenced how entire houses were organized. Drying racks for herbs and onions hung near chimneys. Closets for woolens and leather were built on interior. Walls, not against cold exterior surfaces. Lofts and attic spaces were used for long-term storage of items that benefited from low humidity. What began as an improvised rack over a stove line ended as standard practice hidden inside new walls and cabinets. The principle, vertical zoning by temperature and moisture, became architectural common sense. County assessment books listed improved houses, larger barns, increased livestock counts. Property valuations rose as homesteads matured into working farms. Museum inventories cataloged surviving kitchen fittings from the late 1800s, including overhead racks and high shelves marked by smoke, wear, and nail holes. Frontier stories often highlight courage and hardship. The records point just as clearly to small, quiet design decisions that compounded over time. A slatted rack was not dramatic; its effect was. Tax and assessment ledgers marked increases in building value across Dakota Territory and the new states of North and South Dakota after 1889. Farm memoirs noted nothing wasted as a badge of competence, not just thrift. Waste meant failure. Efficiency meant survival. An approximate lifetime calculation: if a family's bread loft prevented one failed batch per month through 6 cold months each year, Over 20 years, that meant 240 loaves preserved. At 2 pounds per loaf, that was 480 pounds of flour, equivalent to 5 98-pound sacks. Add the cost of yeast, the freight charges, and the fuel for emergency rebaking, and the savings became significant. Multiply that across thousands of similar homesteads, and the effect becomes visible in aggregated statistics. Freight figures show flour shipments stabilizing. Store orders show fewer panic purchases midwinter. Farm outputs improved as labor and capital were redirected from correcting waste to building infrastructure. Agricultural statistics documented rising farm numbers and improved building stock in the Dakotas by 1900. The population that had dropped sharply after the hard winter of 1880 to 1881 rebounded and grew. Settlement density increased. Farms proved up and expanded. Stacked against droughts, blizzards, and market swings, a slatted rack seems trivial. Yet it stands as one example of how closely watching air, moisture, and waste turned marginal homesteads into durable farms. In a region where some systems failed, open-range winters, single-wall shacks, unventilated dugouts, the distance between sour and sweet bread was measured not in miles from the mill or dollars in the bank, but in the short climb from a damp cellar box to a slatted frame riding the stove's invisible updraft.